The rain pelted down on the bustling New York streets as Alexander Reed frowned at his phone. His driver had just texted that he was sick with the flu and couldn't make it. Alexander glanced at his watch, Italian-made, worth more than what most people earned in months, and sighed. He was already running late for his meeting with investors. At 38, Alexander had the world at his fingertips. His tech company, which had started in his college dorm room, had sold for billions 3 years ago. Now he spent his days growing his wealth, living between his Manhattan penthouse and vacation homes scattered across the globe. Great timing, he muttered, looking up at the darkening sky. The rain was coming down harder now, soaking through his expensive suit. He spotted a small cafe across the street. Nothing fancy, just a neighborhood place with a faded sign and warm yellow lights inside. Not his usual scene, but it would do until he could get a rideshare. The bell jingled as he pushed open the bar door. The cafe smelled of coffee and freshly baked bread. It was half full with a mix of students typing on laptops and older folks reading newspapers. Alexander chose a corner table, shaking raindrops from his coat and running a hand through his dark hair. He pulled out his phone and started answering emails. A business didn't run itself even when you were worth billions. The cafe's chatter faded into the background as he focused on work, barely noticing when someone approached his table. "What can I get for you today?" That voice. Alexander knew that voice. It had once whispered good morning to him, had once laughed at his jokes, had once told him she loved him. He looked up slowly, not quite believing what he was hearing. Elena stood before him dressed in a simple blue uniform with a small name tag. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she looked thinner than he remembered, with new lines around her eyes. But she was still beautiful, the kind of beauty that came from within and couldn't be bought. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to stop turning for a moment. Alexander saw shock flash across her face, quickly followed by something else. Was it shame? Pride? He couldn't tell anymore. 2 years ago, he would have known exactly what she was thinking. "Alexander," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She clutched her notepad tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Elena," he replied, finding his own voice. I didn't expect to see you here." What an understatement. The last time they'd been in the same room was at their divorce proceedings. Elena had sat across from him at a long table, refusing to meet his eyes as lawyers discussed the division of assets. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed when they were young and in love, back when his company was just a hopeful idea, had left her with a settlement that was generous by normal standards, but a drop in the bucket of his wealth. He'd heard through mutual friends that she had refused to touch the money. Too proud, they said. He had respected that in a way, even as he moved on with his life. "I work here now," she said, stating the obvious. There was no bitterness in her voice, just fact. "What would you like to order?" Before Alexander could answer, a cry came from somewhere in the back of the cafe. A baby's cry, high-pitched and demanding. Elena's head snapped toward the sound. "Elena, sorry to interrupt," called a middle-aged woman from behind the counter. "The little one's awake from his nap, sounds hungry." "I'll be right there, Rita," Elena called back. Then to Alexander, "Our cook makes a great club sandwich, the coffee's decent too." Alexander nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His mind was racing, doing quick math. They had been divorced for 2 years. That baby sounded young, very young. "That sounds fine," he managed. "Coffee, black." Elena scribbled on her pad and hurried toward a door marked, "Staff only." As she opened it, Alexander caught a glimpse of a playpen in what looked like a small break room. He couldn't see the baby, but the cries grew louder for a moment before the door swung shut. The coffee arrived, brought by the woman called Rita. Alexander stared into the dark liquid, his meeting forgotten. He took out his phone to cancel it, his fingers moving automatically while his thoughts remained on Elena and that cry. They had talked about children once in the early days. Elena had wanted a big family, at least 3 kids, she'd said. Alexander had agreed back then, picturing little versions of themselves running around their starter apartment. But as his company grew, those conversations happened less often. There was always another milestone to reach, another round of funding to secure. Family planning got pushed further and further down their list of priorities. By the time he sold the company, their marriage was already crumbling. Success had changed him, Elena had said during one of their final arguments. He'd become obsessed with deals and acquisitions, with being the youngest billionaire in the tech world. She'd said she didn't recognize him anymore. Maybe she had been right. The door opened again and Elena emerged, now with a small bundle in her arms. Alexander couldn't see much from his angle, just a blue blanket and a tiny hand reaching up toward Elena's face. She was smiling down at the baby, a smile he hadn't seen in years, soft, genuine, full of love. She handed the baby to Rita and returned to waiting tables. Alexander watched as she moved from table to table, taking orders, bringing food, clearing dishes. She was efficient and friendly with customers, but he could see her glancing toward the counter every few minutes, checking on the baby. His coffee grew cold as he sat there, unable to leave, unable to approach her again. The minutes ticked by. Once the baby turned in Rita's arms and Alexander caught a glimpse of a small face, round cheeks, button nose, and eyes that looked strangely familiar. When Elena passed by his table again, he spoke up. "How old?" She paused, knowing exactly what he was asking. 8 months, she replied softly, not meeting his gaze. 8 months, plus pregnancy. The timing lined up too perfectly to be a coincidence. Is he? Alexander couldn't finish the question. Elena finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I need to get back to work." She walked away, leaving his question hanging in the air between them. Alexander left money on the table, far too much for a coffee he didn't drink, and stepped back into the rain, which now seemed fitting for the storm brewing inside him. As he hailed a taxi, his mind was filled not with thoughts of his missed meeting or business deals, but of a baby with familiar eyes and the woman who had once been his wife. He needed answers, and he knew he would. Be back. Alexander barely slept for the next 3 nights. He would lie awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling as the city lights cast shadows across his bedroom. The image of Elena in that waitress uniform kept flashing in his mind, along with the distant cry of a baby he'd barely glimpsed. During important meetings, he found himself drifting off, wondering about Elena's life now. What had happened to her dreams? In college, she had been the star of the architecture program. Professors had praised her innovative designs, her unique vision. She had talked of creating buildings that would change skylines, structures that would blend beauty with function. She had supported him back then, when his company was nothing but an idea sketched on napkins. While he worked through the night coding, she had taken extra jobs waiting tables and tutoring to keep their tiny apartment's rent paid. The irony wasn't lost on him. She was waiting tables again, but this time he was worth billions. "Mr. Reed, did you hear the question?" his chief financial officer asked, pulling him back to the present. "Sorry, Tom, my mind was elsewhere." Alexander straightened in his chair. Run through those numbers again, but even as his team discussed the potential acquisition of a smaller tech firm, his thoughts kept returning to the cafe. To Elena. To the baby. "You seem distracted lately," his assistant Diane commented as she handed him his schedule for the next day. "Is everything all right?" Alexander looked at the woman who had organized his life for the past 5 years. She knew almost everything about him, except the mess he'd made of his marriage. "Just tired," he replied. "Listen, clear my lunch tomorrow. I have somewhere to be." Diane raised an eyebrow but made the change without comment. That was why he paid her the salary of a senior executive. Discretion. The next day, Alexander found himself back at the cafe, this time deliberately. He chose a different table, one with a clear view of the staff door. He ordered a sandwich he didn't want and coffee he wouldn't drink, and he waited. The lunch rush came and went. Alexander sat there answering emails on his phone but glancing up each time the staff door opened. Finally, around 2 in the afternoon, Elena emerged carrying the baby on her hip. The boy was dressed in simple blue overalls and a striped shirt. His dark hair stuck up in all directions, and his chubby hands waved excitedly as Rita made funny faces at him. Alexander caught his breath as the baby turned toward the dining area, curious eyes scanning the room. Those eyes. Alexander would recognize them anywhere. The distinct shade of amber with flecks of gold. The same eyes that looked back at him from the mirror each morning. The same eyes his father had, and his grandfather before him. Reed eyes, unmistakable and rare. And there was more. The cleft in the baby's chin, slight but noticeable. Another Reed family trait that had marked the men in his family for generations. Alexander felt like the air had been sucked from his lungs. There was no doubt in his mind now. That was his son. Elena set the baby down in a high chair near the counter and tied a small bib around his neck. She spooned something from a jar into his mouth, talking to him softly as she did. Alexander couldn't hear the words, but he could see the love in her face. The baby babbled and reached for the spoon, making Elena laugh. When was the last time he had heard her laugh? 2 years? 3? The sound carried across the cafe, and it struck him how much he had missed it. Elena looked up, suddenly aware of being watched. Her smile faded when she saw Alexander. She said something to Rita, who nodded and took over feeding the baby. Elena approached his table, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're back," she said simply. Alexander nodded. "I wanted to see you again." "Why?" The question was direct, her tone guarded. Before he could answer, the baby let out a happy shriek, banging his hands on the high chair tray. "What's his name?" Alexander asked softly. Elena hesitated, then answered, "James. His name is James." James, Alexander's middle name, passed down from his mother's side of the family. Was that a coincidence? He doubted it. "He looks like you," she added, almost reluctantly. "When were you going to tell me?" Alexander kept his voice low, aware they were in a public place. "I wasn't sure I ever would," Elena admitted. Her honesty stung, but he respected it. She had never been one to sugarcoat things even when they were happy. "Why not?" Elena glanced back at James, who was now smearing food on his face while Rita laughed. "You made it very clear our marriage was a mistake, that you needed to focus on your empire. Why would I think you'd want the complication of a child?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, because they were true. During the divorce, he had been cold, businesslike. He had told his lawyers to wrap things up quickly so he could move on. He had been so consumed with his success that losing Elena had felt like an acceptable casualty in his climb to the top. What a fool he had been. "Elena, we need to talk about this properly," he said. "Not here." She crossed her arms, defensive. "I'm working. Some of us have to." "After your shift then," he pressed. "Please." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, she nodded. "I finish at 7. There's a park across the street. I need to take James for some fresh air anyway." "Thank you," Alexander said, relief washing over him. Elena turned to go back to her son, then paused. "Just so we're clear, if you're thinking of using your money and lawyers to take him from me, don't bother coming tonight." The fierceness in her voice reminded him of the woman he had fallen in love with years ago, determined, principled, unafraid. "That's not what I want," he assured her, though in truth, he wasn't sure what he wanted yet, except answers. She nodded once and returned to James, who greeted her with a gummy smile that transformed his little face. Alexander watched them together for a few more minutes. The easy way Elena wiped food from James's chin, the gentle kiss she placed on his head, the natural rhythm they had together. He had missed so much already. As he left the cafe, he felt a strange mixture of emotions. Anger that she had kept this secret. Sadness for the time lost. And underneath it all, a tiny spark of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. At 7 o'clock, he would meet his son for the first time. The thought terrified and excited him in equal measure. For a man who had built his fortune taking calculated risks, this felt like the biggest gamble of his life. Alexander arrived at the park 15 minutes early. He sat on a bench facing the cafe across the street, watching people hurry home after work. The rain had stopped, but the evening air was cool and damp. He had changed into more casual clothes, jeans and a sweater instead of his usual tailored suit, hoping to look less intimidating. As he waited, he scrolled through his phone, but not to check emails or stock prices. Instead, he was looking at pictures he hadn't viewed in years. Photos of him and Elena in happier times, hiking in the mountains, laughing at a friend's wedding, cooking together in their first apartment. He paused on one image, Elena sleeping with her head on his shoulder during a long flight. He had taken the picture without her knowing, capturing a rare moment of peaceful vulnerability. What had happened to them? When had he stopped seeing her? Really seeing her? At exactly 7, Elena walked into the park pushing a stroller. She had changed out of her work uniform into jeans and a simple blue sweater. Her hair was down now, falling in waves past her shoulders. Alexander stood up, suddenly nervous. She stopped a few feet away. "You came?" "Of course I did," he replied. His eyes moved to the stroller where James was sitting, looking around with curious eyes. The baby was bundled in a light jacket, a small knit hat covering his dark hair. Alexander hesitated, then asked, "Can I see him properly?" Elena nodded and pushed the stroller closer. James looked up at Alexander, studying this new person with serious concentration. Then, unexpectedly, the baby smiled, a wide, toothless grin that transformed his little face. "He likes you," Elena said softly, sounding almost surprised. Alexander felt something shift inside him, a protective instinct he'd never experienced before. This was his child, his son. The reality of it hit him like a physical force. "How did this happen, Elena?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I think you know how babies are made, Alexander." "That's not what I meant," he said, though he appreciated her attempt to break the tension. "The timing. We were already separated when—" Elena sighed and sat down on the bench. She began rocking the stroller gently with one hand. "Remember that night? About a week before the divorce was finalized?" she asked. Alexander nodded. How could he forget? He had come to the apartment to pick up the last of his things. Elena had been there packing books into boxes. They had started arguing about something trivial. Then suddenly they were in each other's arms, clinging to what they were about to lose. "I found out 2 weeks after the papers were signed," she said quietly. "I took 3 tests because I couldn't believe it." Alexander sat down beside her, keeping some distance between them. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena looked at him directly, her expression a mix of hurt and defiance. "You made it very clear our marriage was holding you back, that you needed freedom to build your empire. What was I supposed to think you'd want with a baby?" The words stung because they contained truth. During the divorce, he had talked about needing space, about focusing on his business without distractions. He had said things he couldn't take back now. "You should have told me anyway," he said finally. "He's my son too." "I know," she admitted, looking down at James, who was now playing with a small toy attached to his stroller. "Maybe I was wrong, but I was hurt and angry and scared." "Scared? Of what?" "Of you using your money and power to take him from me," she said bluntly. "You have the best lawyers money can buy. I'm a waitress living in a 1-bedroom apartment above a cafe." Alexander felt a surge of shame. Had he really made her fear him so much? "I wouldn't have done that," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure it was true. The Alexander from 2 years ago, driven, ruthless, focused only on success, might have seen a child as another asset to control. "Wouldn't you?" Elena challenged. "The man I knew at the end of our marriage was a stranger to me. He cared about deals and acquisitions, not people." Her words hung in the air between them. James babbled suddenly, reaching up toward Elena. She lifted him from the stroller and settled him on her lap. "I hired someone," Alexander admitted. "A private investigator. After I saw you at the cafe." Elena tensed. "Checking up on me?" "I needed to know," he said simply. "And what did your spy find out?" Her voice was cold now. "That you live in an apartment above the cafe?" That you work double shifts. That James was born 7 months after our divorce. He paused. That you haven't touched the settlement money. Elena bounced James gently as he began to fuss. I didn't want anything from you. Why not? You deserved it. You supported me when I had nothing. That money, it felt like a payoff. Like you were buying your way out of our marriage. She looked away. I couldn't touch it. Alexander understood. Pride. He respected it even when it was impractical. The birth certificate, he said after a moment, it doesn't list a father. Elena nodded. I didn't know what to do. By the time I realized I was pregnant, we were already divorced. You had moved on. James reached out suddenly, grabbing for Alexander's watch. Without thinking, Alexander offered his finger instead. The baby gripped it tightly, his tiny finger surprisingly strong. I'll need a DNA test, Alexander said quietly, watching his son hold on to him. I know, Elena replied, her voice equally soft. Though I don't think you really need one. He looks just like you. It was true. Looking at James now, Alexander could see his own features reflected back at him. The shape of his eyes, the cleft in his chin, even the way the baby furrowed his brow in concentration. What do you want, Alexander? Elena asked suddenly. Money? I won't stop you from providing for him. Visits? We can arrange something. But if you think you can just walk in and take over, I don't know what I want yet, he interrupted honestly. Except to know my son, to be his father, not just someone who sends checks. James was getting restless now, squirming in Elena's arms. She stood up, settling him back in the stroller. It's past his bedtime, she explained. We should go. Alexander stood too, reluctant for the meeting to end. Can I see him again? Both of you? Elena studied his face as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, she nodded. Sunday. The cafe is closed. You can come to my apartment around noon. Thank you, Alexander said, genuinely grateful. As they parted ways, Alexander watched Elena push the stroller down the path. James looked back over his mother's shoulder, those familiar eyes finding Alexander's. The baby raised a small hand, almost like a wave. Alexander lifted his own hand in response, feeling a connection that transcended the mistakes of the past. Whatever happened next, he knew his life had changed forever. The DNA test results came back on Friday morning. Alexander was in the middle of a conference call when his phone buzzed with the notification. He excused himself quickly, stepping out of the boardroom and leaving his confused executives staring after him. In the hallway, he opened the email with trembling fingers. The clinical language confirmed what he already knew in his heart. James was his son. The probability of paternity was 99.9999999%. Alexander leaned against the wall, letting the reality wash over him. He had a child, a son. Despite having suspected it from the first moment he saw James's familiar eyes, seeing the confirmation in black and white made it undeniably real. His lawyer had called twice already that morning, eager to discuss options. Alexander knew what those options were. With his resources, he could easily file for custody, citing Elena's financial situation as evidence that the child would be better off with him. He could offer her money to give up rights. He could make her life very difficult. But as he stood there holding the test results, Alexander found himself thinking not of legal strategies, but of the look on Elena's face when she held James. Pure love, fierce protectiveness. And he thought of his own childhood in a mansion filled with expensive toys but empty of warmth, raised by nannies while his father built a business empire. No, he wouldn't repeat those mistakes. By Sunday, Alexander had made up his mind. He climbed the narrow stairs above the cafe carrying a small gift bag. Elena's apartment was at the end of the hallway. 3B, the investigator's report had said. He hesitated, then knocked. Elena opened the door with James on her hip. The baby was dressed, in overalls and a red shirt, his hair damp and curly from a recent bath. He babbled excitedly when he saw Alexander. Come in, Elena said, stepping aside. Her apartment was small but neat and bright. The main room served as both living room and kitchen, with a hallway leading presumably to a bedroom and bathroom. What struck Alexander most was how homey it felt. Colorful rugs on the wooden floor, plants on the windowsills, James's toys organized in baskets. There were no signs of luxury, but there was comfort and care in every corner. A drawing table stood by the window, covered with sketches and drafting tools. Elena's architecture dreams weren't completely forgotten then. "I got the test results," Alexander said, sitting down on the sofa when Elena gestured for him to do so. "And?" she asked, though they both knew the answer. "He's mine." The words felt strange on his tongue, wonderful and terrifying at once. Elena nodded, setting James down on a playmat where he immediately began stacking colorful blocks. "I never doubted it." "I brought something for him," Alexander said, offering the gift bag. Elena took it cautiously and pulled out a soft stuffed elephant. "Thank you. That's thoughtful." She handed the toy to James, who grabbed it with delight, examining it with serious concentration before giving it a drooly kiss. "He approves," she said with a small smile. Alexander watched his son play, marveling at how perfect he was. Those tiny fingers, that determined expression as he tried to stack one more block on his wobbly tower. "My lawyers want me to file for custody," he said abruptly. Elena stiffened, her face paling. "Of course they do. I'm not going to," he added quickly. She looked at him, confusion and caution in her eyes. "Then what do you want?" Alexander had rehearsed this moment, but now that it was here, the carefully prepared speech felt wrong. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "I want to be his father, Elena. Not just on paper or from a distance. I want to be part of his life. And," he hesitated, "I want to help you too." "I don't need your charity," she said immediately, that familiar pride flashing in her eyes. "It's not charity, it's responsibility, it's—" He struggled to find the right words. "It's trying to make things right." James toppled his tower of blocks and laughed, delighted by the crash. The sound broke the tension momentarily. "What exactly are you proposing?" Elena asked, picking up a block and handing it back to the baby. Alexander took a deep breath. "I'd like to support James financially, healthcare, education, everything he needs. And I'd like to help you finish your architecture degree." Elena's head snapped up. "How did you know I didn't finish?" "The investigator," he admitted. "You were only a semester away when we split up." She was quiet for a moment, absently straightening James's shirt as he played. "I couldn't afford the tuition after the divorce. I tried working and studying, but then James came along. You could go back now," Alexander suggested. "I could help with childcare, tuition, whatever you need." "Why would you do that?" she asked, suspicious. "What's in it for you?" It was a fair question. The Alexander she had known at the end of their marriage never did anything without calculating the return on investment. "Because I was wrong," he said simply. "When the company took off, I changed. I became obsessed with success, with being the youngest billionaire in tech. I forgot what really mattered." Elena didn't respond, but her expression softened slightly. "I'm not asking to get back together," he clarified, though part of him wondered if that might be possible someday. "I'm just asking for a chance to be James's father, to co-parent with you, no strings attached." James crawled over to Alexander then, pulling himself up on the sofa. Without thinking, Alexander lifted him onto his lap. The baby reached up to touch his face, patting his cheek with a damp hand. "Duh," James said clearly. Alexander's heart nearly stopped. He looked at Elena, who seemed equally surprised. "That's new," she said softly. "He's just learning to talk." "Duh," James repeated more insistently, bouncing on Alexander's knee. "He's a smart kid," Alexander said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside him. Elena watched them together, her expression thoughtful. After a long moment, she said, "I've kept something for you to see." She went to a closet and pulled out a cardboard box. From it, she extracted a large portfolio. "My designs," she explained, setting it on the coffee table. I still work on them, sometimes late at night after James is asleep. Alexander opened the portfolio carefully. Inside were detailed architectural drawings, innovative, sustainable building designs, just as impressive as he remembered from their college days. "These are amazing, Elena," he said honestly. "You're too talented to be serving coffee." For the first time that day, she smiled genuinely. "The cafe pays the bills." "But it's not your dream," he reminded her. James grew restless on Alexander's lap, reaching for his mother. Elena took him, settling him against her shoulder where he began to look sleepy. "I'll think about your offer," she said finally. "No promises, but I'll think about it." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. For now, that was enough. As Alexander prepared to leave, he asked, "Can I see him again next Sunday?" Elena nodded. "We usually go to the playground in the morning. You could meet us there, around 10? "I'll be there," Alexander promised. He hesitated, then gently touched James's head. "Bye, little guy. See you soon." As he walked down the stairs, Alexander felt lighter than he had in years. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but for the first time in a long time he was thinking, beyond quarterly reports and profit margins. He was thinking about Sunday mornings at the playground, about first steps and first words, about being the kind of father his son deserved, the kind of man he wanted to be again. 1 year later, Alexander sat in the audience of the university auditorium, James bouncing on his lap. At nearly 2 years old, his son was a bundle of energy, constantly moving and exploring. Today, though, James was dressed in his best outfit, tiny pants and a button-up shirt that Alexander had helped him into that morning. "Sit still, buddy," Alexander whispered, gently adjusting the little bow tie that James kept tugging at. "Mama's coming soon." On stage, the dean was reading names of architecture graduates. Alexander felt a surge of pride when finally he heard Elena read. Elena walked across the stage in her cap and gown, accepting her diploma with a radiant smile. From their seats in the front row, Alexander lifted James's hand to help him wave. James, seeing his mother, let out an excited, "Mama!" that echoed through the auditorium, causing a ripple of fond laughter. The past year hadn't been easy, but they had found their rhythm. After considering Alexander's offer for 2 weeks, Elena had agreed to return to school while Alexander helped with James. They had drawn up a co-parenting agreement, one that Alexander's lawyers had complained was too generous to Elena, but that Alexander knew was fair. 3 days a week, James stayed with Alexander in his penthouse, which now had a colorful nursery where an unused office had once been. The other 4 days, James was with Elena in her apartment, which she had, kept despite Alexander's offers to help her find a bigger place. "One step at a time," she had said. After the ceremony, Alexander made his way through the crowd, carrying James toward where Elena stood talking with her professors. She spotted them and waved, excusing herself to come meet them. "You did it," Alexander said, genuinely proud. "Top of your class, too." Elena blushed slightly. Having time to actually study made a difference. She reached for James, who went happily into her arms, immediately grabbing for the tassel on her cap. "Did you behave for Daddy?" she asked him. "Good boy," James declared, a phrase he had recently learned and used at every opportunity. Alexander laughed. He was perfect, just a little squirmy during the speeches. They made their way outside to the garden where a reception was being held. The May sunshine warmed the day, and students in their gowns posed for pictures with proud families. Alexander had arranged for a small celebration at Elena's favorite restaurant afterward, but he hadn't told her yet. It was a day worth celebrating, properly. "Ms. Reed?" A man in a tailored suit approached them. "I'm David Chen from Foster & Partners. Your professor shared your sustainable housing project with us. I'd love to talk to you about an opening we have." Elena's eyes widened. Foster & Partners was one of the most prestigious architecture firms in the city. Yes, of course," she managed, trying to maintain her composure. "Great. Here's my card. Call my office Monday to set up a proper interview." He smiled and moved on to greet other graduates. Elena stared at the card in her hand. "Did you arrange this?" she asked Alexander suspiciously. "Not at all," he said truthfully. "Your talent did that all on its own." She studied his face, then nodded, believing him. "I can't believe it. Foster and Partners." James, bored with the adult conversation, squirmed to be put down. Elena set him on the grass, where he immediately crouched to examine a dandelion. "He needs the park after sitting still so long," she said, watching him with fond eyes. "How about we go to the one near the cafe?" Alexander suggested. "For old time's sake." Elena smiled. "That sounds perfect." Later that afternoon, they sat on the same bench where they had met for that first difficult conversation a year ago. James ran back and forth on the grass in front of them, occasionally stopping to pick up sticks or leaves that caught his interest. "The cafe looks different," Alexander commented, nodding toward the building across the street. The small neighborhood Café had expanded with a fresh coat of paint and a new sign. Rita's, it now read in elegant script. Alexander had helped the former manager buy the place when the previous owner wanted to sell. He considered it a good investment in more ways than one. "She's doing well," Elena said. "Business is up since..." She expanded the menu. They watched James play in comfortable silence. So much had changed since they had sat on this bench a year ago. Tense, uncertain, full of complicated emotions. "Have you thought about the offer from Chen?" Alexander asked eventually. Elena nodded. "I'm going to call on Monday. It's an amazing opportunity." "And the commute?" Foster and Partners was downtown, a good 45 minutes from Elena's apartment. "I've been thinking," she said hesitantly. "Maybe it is time for a change. A place closer to downtown, with a proper room for James instead of him sleeping in the living room when he's with me." Alexander nodded, careful not to push. Every step of their rebuilt relationship had been taken slowly, deliberately. "I could help you look," he offered. "I'd like that," she said with a small smile. James came running back to them holding a yellow dandelion. "For you," he said, offering it to Elena with a proud grin. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, taking it and pretending to smell it appreciatively. James turned to Alexander. "Park tomorrow?" It wasn't Alexander's day according to their schedule, but he glanced at Elena questioningly. "Actually," she said, "I was wondering if you wanted to come over for dinner tonight, to celebrate the graduation. The three of us." It would be the first time they had dinner together as a family in her apartment. Until now, handovers had been quick and practical, focused on James rather than on them. "I'd love to," Alexander said, feeling a flutter of hope that he tried to keep in check. James, delighted with this plan, clapped his hands. "Dinner with Daddy." As they walked toward Elena's apartment, James between them holding both their hands, and occasionally jumping to be swung forward, Alexander reflected on how differently things had turned out than he could have imagined when he first ducked into that cafe to escape the rain. Back then, he had measured his success in dollars and deals. Now watching his son laugh as Elena pretended to count his toes through his shoes, he understood that true wealth had nothing to do with money at all. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked, catching him watching them. "Just that I'm lucky," he said simply. "We all are," she replied, and for the first time in years she reached out and briefly squeezed his hand. It was a small gesture, but to Alexander, it felt like the beginning of something new, something better than success, something like happiness. James tugged at both, their hands impatient to move forward. Together they swung him gently over a crack in the sidewalk, their son's laughter floating up into the evening air. The sweetest sound Alexander had ever heard.